The courthouse fire of 1947 burned everything except the screams. In the basement archives of Kensington County, West Virginia, 23 wooden filing cabinets containing 40 years of criminal records turned to ash in a single night, leaving behind only the smell of secrets and the taste of smoke that witnesses claimed never quite left their mouths. This isn't just another cold case. It's the deliberate erasure of evidence that could have exposed the most systematic killing spree in Appalachian history. The mountains of West Virginia have always been good at keeping secrets. Ridges that slice the sky like broken teeth, hollows so deep that noon feels like dusk, and communities where bloodlines run as twisted as the roads that connect them. In 1926, when the first bodies started appearing along Tillinghast Creek, the isolation that protected these families from outside judgment also protected them from outside justice. The creek itself wound through 3 counties, its waters dark with mountain runoff, and something else, something that made the local wildlife avoid its banks and turned the stones black where it touched them. Ewell Tillinghast found the first victim on October 13, 1926, while checking his traps near Devil's Backbone Ridge. Sarah Kingsley, 17 years old, had been missing from the neighboring county for 6 days. What Ewell found wasn't quite a body anymore. It was a message. The positioning was too deliberate, too ritualistic to be the work of animals or a single deranged mind. This was craftsmanship, and it suggested practitioners who had been perfecting their methods for far longer than anyone wanted to admit. Before we dig deeper into these mountains of madness, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your world right now. If this story grips you the way it gripped me during months of research, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed, because what we're about to uncover will challenge everything you thought you knew about American criminal history. The local sheriff, Dwight Elliott, arrived at the scene 3 hours after Ewell's frantic ride into town. Elliott had been keeping the peace in Kensington County for 11 years, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he documented in his incident report, a report that would mysteriously vanish from the files 2 decades later. According to surviving testimonies, Elliott's hands shook so violently while writing that his deputy, Ansel Fairchild, had to finish the paperwork. The details were sparse but disturbing. Evidence of multiple perpetrators, signs of prolonged torture, and symbols carved into nearby trees that neither man recognized but both agreed felt ancient, predatory. What they didn't know was that Sarah Kingsley wasn't the first victim. She was simply the first one found outside the family. The Appalachian communities of the 1920s operated on codes older than law. Blood feuds could span generations. Justice was often personal, and outsiders, especially those asking questions, had a way of disappearing into the ridges. When Elliott began investigating Sarah's death, he encountered a wall of silence so complete it felt coordinated. Neighbors who had lived side by side for decades suddenly claimed to know nothing about missing persons, strange sounds in the night, or the increasing number of abandoned homesteads dotting the mountainsides. But Elliott was persistent, and persistence in Kensington County had a way of becoming dangerous. The first real break came from an unexpected source, Dolly Ingram, the county's telephone operator, who had been listening to conversations she wasn't supposed to hear. In the mountains, party lines meant privacy was a luxury few could afford, and Dolly had developed the habit of staying on the line after connecting calls. What she heard in the weeks following Sarah's murder would haunt her for the rest of her very short life. Names mentioned in hushed tones, locations whispered like prayers, and most disturbing of all, schedules careful, methodical discussions about timing, weather patterns, and the movement of families who had no idea they were being watched. How many small-town phone operators across America have stumbled onto evidence of systematic murder, only to become victims themselves before they could expose the truth? But Dolly Ingram made one crucial mistake. She started taking notes, and in a community where everyone watched everyone, secrets had a way of revealing themselves to exactly the wrong people. Dolly Ingram's hand cramped around the pencil as she wrote her final entry at 11:47 p.m. on November 2, 1926. The basement of the telephone exchange smelled of copper wire and damp concrete, while above her head, the mechanical relays clicked their metallic Morse code of rural conversations, most of them innocent, but some carrying the weight of carefully planned death. What Dolly had discovered over 3 weeks of covert listening would prove that Sarah Kingsley's murder wasn't an isolated act of violence, but the latest operation in a network that had been hunting families across 3 counties for almost a decade. The Exchange Building sat at the crossroads of Kensington County's main thoroughfares, a squat brick structure that hummed with electricity and secrets. Dolly worked the night shift alone, connecting calls between isolated farms and settlements scattered across the mountainous terrain. The job required her to stay alert through the long hours when most decent folks were asleep, but it also provided her with access to conversations that were never meant to have witnesses. She had started taking notes almost by accident, jotting down fragments of strange exchanges that didn't make sense individually, but began forming a pattern when viewed together. The breakthrough came when she connected a call between Imogen Grant, who ran the general store in Blackwater Hollow, and Lowell Dalton, whose family controlled most of the timber operations on the eastern slopes. Dolly had known both of them since childhood, but the voices she heard that night belonged to strangers, cold, clinical, discussing human beings like livestock. Grant mentioned the Morrison family schedule, and the youngest being small enough to transport easily. Dalton responded with details about weather patterns and moon phases, planning that suggested intimate knowledge of how to move through the mountains without being detected. Death had a timetable. What chilled Dolly most wasn't the content of individual conversations, but their frequency. Every few nights, the same voices would connect, sharing updates on inventory, discussing processing locations, and coordinating what they called acquisitions. The terminology was deliberately vague, but when Dolly cross-referenced these calls with missing person reports from Sheriff Elliott's office, the pattern became undeniable. The Morrison family had been reported missing just 2 days after that first overheard conversation. The Hendricks family vanished the week after their schedule was discussed. The timeline was precise, methodical, and ongoing. Dolly's notes revealed something even more disturbing. The network included people from every level of the community. She documented voices belonging to Selena Vanderbilt, the county's most prominent landowner, discussing storage solutions with Chauncey Langston, the circuit judge who visited monthly to handle legal matters. Ellen Barton, who taught school to most of the area's children, provided detailed information about family structures and daily routines. Even Tobias Marshall, the traveling preacher who conducted services when no ordained minister was available, participated in conversations about preparing subjects for transport. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, but it was the casual nature of their discussions that truly terrified her. These weren't desperate criminals driven to violence by circumstance. They were organized, experienced, and completely confident in their immunity from consequences. They spoke about murder the way other people discussed crop rotations or weather patterns, with a comfortable familiarity of long practice. Dolly's final entries documented preparations for what Imogen Grant called the November harvest. Multiple families were being discussed as targets, their movements tracked, their vulnerabilities cataloged. The Kensington family, newcomers who had purchased property near Sunrise Ridge, were mentioned repeatedly. Ewell and Winifred Kensington had 3 children under the age of 10, and according to the intercepted conversations, their isolated location and lack of local connections made them ideal candidates for a full acquisition. But Dolly made a fatal error in judgment. She decided to take her evidence to Sheriff Elliott, not realizing that her weeks of careful documentation had not gone unnoticed by by the very people she was investigating. The telephone exchange's location at the community's crossroads meant that everyone knew Dolly's schedule. Everyone knew she worked alone. And everyone knew that the basement where she spent her nights had only one exit. What Dolly didn't know was that Lowell Dalton owned the building, that Selena Vanderbilt held the mortgage on her family's farm, and that Ellen Barton had been watching her unusually late-night writing sessions through the exchange's street-facing windows. How do you escape a trap when the very people you're trying to expose control every potential avenue of help? On November 4th, 1926, Dolly Ingram's shift ended at sunrise, but she never made it home, and her carefully documented evidence disappeared with her, leaving behind only the mechanical clicking of telephone relays and the growing certainty that the Kensington family's November harvest was about to begin. The Kensington farmhouse windows glowed warm against the mountain darkness on November 8, 1926, while outside, in the tree line, 7 figures moved through the frost-brittle undergrowth with the practiced silence of apex predators. The smell of wood smoke and baking bread drifted from the chimney, mixing with the metallic scent of approaching snow, and something else, the sharp, ozone tang of fear that animals can sense, but humans rarely recognize until it's too late. What happened to the Kensington family over the next 6 hours would establish the template for dozens of similar harvests that authorities would spend decades trying to understand if they lived long enough to investigate. Ewell and Winifred Kensington had moved to Sunrise Ridge in September, drawn by cheap land and the promise of mountain solitude. They had 3 children, Thomas, age 9, Mary, age 7, and baby Catherine, barely 18 months old. Ewell worked as a carpenter, building furniture and cabinets for the growing number of families settling in the area. Winifred kept house and tended their small garden, canning vegetables and preparing for their first mountain winter. They were exactly the kind of isolated, trusting family that the network had learned to identify and exploit. The attack began at 9:37 p.m., precisely timed to coincide with the family's evening routine. According to fragments of testimony that would surface years later, the network had been observing the Kensingtons for weeks, learning their habits through Ellen Barton's regular social visits and Tobias Marshall's pastoral calls. They knew that Ewell would be in his workshop behind the house, that Winifred would be putting the children to bed, and that the family dog, a mixed-breed mutt named Bear, had been mysteriously found dead that morning, removing the only early warning system the family possessed. File note: Sheriff's Department, November 1926. Recovered fragment. Evidence suggests coordinated assault, multiple entry points, no signs of resistance after initial breach. Family dog found 300 yards from house, throat cut clean. Professional work. The precision of the operation revealed extensive planning and experience. Lowell Dalton's crew handled the physical aspects, disabling the telephone line, securing the perimeter, and neutralizing any potential witnesses. Imogen Grant coordinated supplies and transportation. Selena Vanderbilt provided safe houses along predetermined routes through her extensive property holdings. Judge Langston ensured that any official investigation would be delayed, misdirected, or simply buried in legal complications. But it was Ellen Barton who contributed the most crucial element: psychological manipulation. As the local school teacher, she had gained the family's complete trust over multiple visits, learning intimate details about their fears, hopes, and vulnerabilities. When the Kensingtons heard her voice calling from their front porch that night, claiming to need help with a medical emergency, they opened their door without hesitation. Trust, the network had learned, was more effective than any lock. The aftermath painted a picture of systematic brutality, disguised as mysterious disappearance. Neighbors found the farmhouse apparently undisturbed furniture in place, meals half finished on the table, children's toys scattered as if interrupted mid-play. The only signs of violence were subtle: scratch marks on the wooden floors suggesting dragged furniture, small blood stains that had been carefully cleaned but remained visible under close inspection, and an overwhelming smell of lye soap that couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of terror. Sheriff Elliott arrived at the scene on November 10th, 48 hours after the Kensingtons were first reported missing by their closest neighbor, Phoebe Pendleton. Elliott's investigation notes, among the few official documents that survived the courthouse fire, described his growing frustration with witnesses who claimed to have seen nothing, heard nothing, and knew nothing about the family's disappearance. But between the lines of his carefully worded reports, a different story emerged. One of a lawman, beginning to understand that he was investigating not just a crime, but a conspiracy that included people he had trusted for years. They harvested families like crops. The breakthrough came when Elliott discovered Dolly Ingram's body 3 days later, found in a shallow grave beside Tillinghast Creek. Unlike the Kensington family, Dolly hadn't simply vanished. She had been left as a message. The positioning was identical to Sarah Kingsley's murder scene, down to the carved symbols on nearby trees. But this time, there was an addition: a piece of paper, carefully preserved in a glass jar, containing a single line written in Dolly's handwriting. "They know I was listening." Elliott finally understood the scope of what he was facing. The network wasn't just killing for profit or pleasure. They were eliminating anyone who threatened their operations. Dolly's murder served dual purposes: removing a witness and warning others who might be tempted to investigate. The message was clear: cooperation meant survival, while curiosity guaranteed death. But Elliott also realized something else. If Dolly had been taking notes on overheard conversations, those notes might still exist somewhere the network hadn't thought to look. Telephone operators were meticulous record keepers by training, and Dolly had been working nights alone for almost 2 years. If she had documented evidence of the network's activities, and if Elliott could find it before they did, he might finally have the proof needed to expose the conspiracy. What he didn't know was that finding Dolly's hidden evidence would require him to make a choice between justice and survival, a choice that would determine not only his own fate, but the fate of every family still living within the network's hunting grounds. The question wasn't whether Elliott could find the truth, but whether the truth would destroy him before he could use it to save anyone else. Sheriff Dwight Elliott's boots echoed against the wooden planks of the telephone exchange basement at 2:17 a.m. on November 14, 1926, while above his head, the mechanical relays clicked their midnight symphony of secrets and lies. The air tasted of copper wire and old paper, thick with the accumulated whispers of a community that had learned to communicate in code. And beneath it all, the faint but persistent scent of fear sweat that seemed to permeate every building where Dolly Ingram had spent her final weeks. Elliott's search for Dolly's evidence had become a race against time, with the network closing in on anyone who might expose their operations, and he was beginning to suspect that he was next on their list. The basement stretched longer than Elliott had expected, filled with switchboards, cable runs, and filing cabinets containing years of service records. Dolly had worked alone down here for almost 2 years, and if she had been documenting overheard conversations, she would have needed a hiding place that was both accessible during her shifts and invisible to casual inspection. Elliott methodically searched behind equipment panels, inside cable conduits, and beneath loose floorboards, growing more desperate as each potential hiding spot yielded nothing. The breakthrough came when he noticed something odd about the filing cabinet nearest Dolly's workstation. The lock had been recently picked. Scratches around the keyhole suggested repeated forced entry, but the files inside appeared untouched. Elliott realized that someone else had already searched this location, which meant they either found what they were looking for or concluded it wasn't here. But Dolly was smarter than that. If she knew she was being watched, she wouldn't hide evidence in the obvious places. Elliott examined the space more carefully, thinking like someone who spent long, solitary hours in this basement. Where would a cautious woman hide something she needed to access regularly, but keep absolutely secret? The answer came when he noticed a small gap between the main electrical panel and the wall, just wide enough for a slim notebook and positioned where someone working at the switchboard could reach it without being seen from the stairs. File fragment. Personal notes. Sheriff D. Elliott. Found D.I.'s documentation. 3 notebooks. Contents confirm worst fears. Network active since 1,919. Estimated victim count. 47 families. Names, dates, methods all recorded. God help us all. Dolly's notebooks contained 7 years of meticulous documentation. She had been listening to suspicious conversations far longer than Elliott realized, building a comprehensive picture of the network's structure, methods, and leadership. The entries began in January of 1920, just months after she started working nights at the exchange, and revealed that the systematic elimination of families had been occurring with clockwork regularity for almost a decade. The notebooks identified the network's hierarchy with devastating clarity. Selena Vanderbilt emerged as the primary organizer, using her extensive land holdings to provide disposal sites and safe houses. Judge Chauncey Langston handled legal aspects, ensuring that missing person cases were dismissed, property transfers were expedited, and any inconvenient evidence disappeared from official records. Ellen Barton served as the intelligence gatherer, using her position as schoolteacher to identify vulnerable families and gather detailed information about their habits and routines. But it was the operational details that truly horrified Elliott. The network had refined their methods through years of practice, developing standardized procedures for target selection, surveillance, acquisition, and disposal. They preferred isolated families with minimal local connections, avoided taking victims during certain weather conditions that might complicate transportation, and maintained detailed records of processing locations throughout the mountain region. Predators with spreadsheets. The 3rd notebook contained the most damning evidence: financial records. Dolly had somehow obtained documentation showing how the network monetized their operations. Property belonging to disappeared families was quietly absorbed into Vanderbilt's holdings through legal manipulations overseen by Judge Langston. Valuable possessions were fenced through Imogen Grant's general store. Even the victims themselves were commodified. Elliott found references to specialty buyers in distant cities who paid premium prices for what the network euphemistically called exotic merchandise. But the notebooks also revealed Elliott's immediate danger. Dolly's final entries documented growing awareness that her activities had been discovered. She wrote about suspicious questions from Ellen Barton, unexpected visits from Lowell Dalton, and changes in conversation patterns that suggested the network knew they had a security breach. Her last entry, dated November 1st, contained a single chilling line: "They know about the notebooks. Moving evidence tonight. If something happens to me, look for the insurance policy." Elliott understood immediately. Dolly had created backup documentation, hidden separately from these notebooks. But where would a scared woman hide something she considered her life insurance? The answer required thinking beyond the telephone exchange, beyond the obvious hiding places, beyond what the network would expect to search. The revelation came when Elliott remembered something Phoebe Pendleton had mentioned during his investigation of the Kensington disappearance. Dolly had been attending evening services at the small Methodist chapel on Sunrise Ridge, despite living in the opposite direction from the church. The location was isolated. The building was rarely used except for Sunday services. And most importantly, it was one of the few places in the county where the network's key members never gathered. If Dolly had hidden her insurance policy somewhere, the network would never think to look. A church they avoided would be the perfect location. But as Elliott prepared to leave the telephone exchange, he heard something that made his blood freeze: the distinctive sound of multiple vehicles approaching on the mountain road, their engines running low and quiet in the pre-dawn darkness. The network had discovered his investigation, and they were coming to ensure that whatever evidence remained would disappear forever, along with the only lawman who still believed justice was possible in Kensington County. How do you escape hunters who know every trail, every hiding place, every person who might offer sanctuary in 100 square miles of mountain wilderness? Sheriff Dwight Elliott killed the oil lamp and pressed himself against the basement wall as headlights swept across the telephone exchange windows at 2:43 a.m., their beams cutting through the November darkness like searchlights hunting prey. The rumble of multiple engines grew louder as vehicles positioned themselves around the building, while overhead, the mechanical relays continued their innocent clicking, oblivious to the fact that their basement sanctuary was about to become a trap with no escape route. Elliott's discovery of Dolly's evidence had made him the most dangerous man in Kensington County, but only if he could survive long enough to use what he'd learned to expose the network's 7-year killing spree. The basement offered no alternate exits, just the wooden stairs leading up to the main floor, where footsteps now echoed as multiple intruders moved through the building. Elliott clutched Dolly's 3 notebooks against his chest, their pages containing enough evidence to destroy the network's leadership, but only if he could reach someone with the authority and distance to act on the information. The problem was that the network controlled every local authority figure who might help, and the nearest federal officers were more than 100 miles away through mountain roads that Lowell Dalton's crews could easily block. Elliott had 2 advantages: intimate knowledge of the county's geography from 11 years of law enforcement, and the element of surprise. The network expected to find him searching for evidence, not already possessing it. But those advantages would disappear the moment they discovered he had found Dolly's notebooks, which meant his window for escape was measured in minutes, not hours. The building's construction provided an unexpected opportunity. The telephone exchange sat on a stone foundation with a crawl space beneath the basement floor, originally designed to accommodate cable runs, but large enough for a desperate man to squeeze through. Elliott had noticed the access panel during his earlier search, dismissing it as too small to be useful, but now it represented his only chance to avoid the coordinated search happening above his head. File fragment. Personal notes. Sheriff D. Elliott. Network response time suggests advanced planning. They knew I would search for D. I's evidence tonight. How? Who told them? Trust no one local until this reaches federal level. Elliott forced himself through the access panel, the rough stone scraping his jacket as he crawled toward the building's perimeter. The space beneath the foundation was cramped, filled with spider webs and decades of accumulated debris, but it led to an external drainage grate that opened near the tree line behind the exchange. The crawl took precious minutes, during which he could hear voices above discussing search patterns and potential escape routes. They were systematic, experienced, and increasingly frustrated by his absence. He emerged from the drainage grate 50 yards from the building, concealed by a stand of pine trees that provided cover but no long-term sanctuary. The network had positioned vehicles on the main roads, but Elliott knew trails through the mountains that were too narrow for automobiles, old hunting paths, and logging roads that would allow him to reach Sunrise Ridge Methodist Chapel without using the monitored routes. Justice crawled through darkness. The chapel sat 3 miles away through terrain that Elliott had traveled countless times during hunting seasons, but never at night while being pursued by killers who knew the mountains as well as he did. The November cold bit through his jacket as he moved between trees, using techniques learned during his brief military service to avoid making noise on the frost-brittle ground. Behind him, flashlight beams swept through the exchange building as the network conducted their search, but ahead lay the more immediate danger. Lowell Dalton's logging crews, who knew every game trail and stream crossing in the region. Elliott reached the chapel at 4:15 a.m., guided by the silhouette of its small steeple against the star-filled sky. The building was older than most structures in the county, built by the first Methodist families to settle the area and maintained through generations of donated labor. Its isolation made it perfect for Dolly's purposes. Few people visited except for Sunday services, and the network's leadership had never shown interest in religious gatherings. The chapel's interior smelled of old wood and candle wax, with moonlight filtering through plain glass windows to illuminate simple wooden pews and a modest altar. Elliott searched methodically, thinking like a frightened woman who needed to hide something absolutely crucial but maintain easy access for regular updates. The answer came when he examined the small pump organ that provided music for services, an instrument complex enough to contain hidden compartments, but familiar enough that Dolly could access them without appearing suspicious. Behind the organ's rear panel, Elliott found what Dolly had called her insurance policy, a fourth notebook, larger than the others, containing detailed maps of disposal sites, photographs of evidence she had somehow obtained, and most importantly, a complete list of network members that included names he recognized from the county seat and state capitol. The scope of the conspiracy extended far beyond Kensington County. It was a regional operation with connections to legitimate businesses, political figures, and law enforcement agencies throughout West Virginia. But the notebook also contained something else: Dolly's planned escape route. She had been preparing to flee with her evidence, armed with contacts in the federal government who could provide protection in exchange for testimony. Elliott realized that Dolly's murder wasn't just about silencing a witness. It was about preventing the network's exposure at the highest levels of state and federal law enforcement. As Elliott studied Dolly's escape plan, he heard the distant sound of vehicles approaching the chapel. The network had anticipated his destination, using the same logical reasoning that led him to search for Dolly's insurance policy. They were closing in again, but this time Elliott possessed something that could destroy them completely if he could survive long enough to deliver it to the federal contacts Dolly had identified. The question was no longer whether Elliott could expose the network, but whether he could reach safety before they demonstrated why 47 families had disappeared without a trace over 7 years of systematic hunting. Sheriff Dwight Elliott's hands trembled as he tore pages from Dolly's final notebook at 4:38 a.m., stuffing the most crucial evidence inside his jacket, while vehicle headlights swept across the chapel windows like lighthouse beams searching for shipwrecks. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the mountain hollow, followed by the careful footsteps of men who had done this before, who knew that cornered prey required patience and precision to capture alive. Elliott's discovery of the network's federal connections had transformed him from a local threat into a national security risk, and the people closing in on the chapel had resources that extended far beyond the mountains of West Virginia. Dolly's insurance policy revealed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of state government. Governor Harrison Caldwell's administration had been receiving monthly payments through a shell company controlled by Selena Vanderbilt. State Police Captain Marcus Whitmore was listed as receiving consulting fees for ensuring that missing person investigations remained localized and understaffed. Most disturbing of all, Federal District Attorney Raymond Pierce had been actively suppressing any federal investigation into the disappearances, claiming lack of jurisdiction while privately coordinating with Judge Langston to bury evidence. The financial records showed payments totaling over $400,000 since 1920. Enough money to buy silence at every level of law enforcement and ensure that the network's operations remained invisible to outside scrutiny. But Dolly had also identified the weak link in this chain of corruption. Special Agent William Crawford of the Bureau of Investigation, who had been conducting an unauthorized investigation into the disappearances after receiving tips from concerned citizens in neighboring states. File fragment. Personal correspondence. Agent W. Crawford. Systematic pattern suggests organized criminal enterprise. Local authorities compromised. Federal intervention necessary. Request authorization for undercover operation in Kensington County region. Crawford's correspondence, which Dolly had somehow obtained through her federal contacts, revealed that the Bureau suspected the existence of the network, but lacked sufficient evidence to justify a full investigation. The agent had been working alone, building a case through careful documentation of the disappearance patterns and financial irregularities he detected through banking records. Most importantly, Crawford was scheduled to arrive in Charleston, West Virginia on November 16th, just 2 days away, to meet with a confidential informant who claimed to have inside knowledge of the operation. Elliott realized that Dolly had intended to be that informant, but her murder had created an opportunity for him to take her place. If he could reach Charleston with the evidence, Crawford would have everything needed to bring federal charges against the entire network. But getting there alive would require surviving the next few hours and traveling more than 200 miles through territory where the network had eyes and resources everywhere. Death had a federal budget. The chapel offered no hiding places adequate for a prolonged siege, but it did provide something more valuable: a telegraph key connected to the county's communication network. Elliott had noticed the equipment during his search, installed to allow the circuit preacher to coordinate services across multiple communities. If he could send a message to Crawford's office in Charleston, he might be able to arrange federal protection for the journey, or at least ensure that the evidence survived. Even if he didn't, Elliott composed his message carefully, using law enforcement codes that the network's local operatives might not recognize. Kensington County situation. Critical stop 47 families confirmed. Stop federal intervention required. Stop evidence secured. Stop request. Immediate assistance. Stop Elliott Sheriff Dept. Stop. The response came within minutes, but it wasn't from Crawford's office. Instead, the telegraph clattered out a message that made Elliott's blood freeze. Elliott, stop surrender evidence immediately. Stop no federal assistance available. Stop resistance futile. Stop last warning. Stop Whitmore State Police. Stop. The network's corruption extended even into the telegraph system, allowing them to intercept and redirect his communications. Elliott realized that his message had not only failed to reach federal authorities, it had revealed his exact location to State Police Captain Whitmore, who was undoubtedly coordinating with the teams surrounding the chapel. The trap was closing with military precision, and Elliott's options were narrowing to a single desperate choice. But Dolly's notebook contained one final piece of information that might provide salvation: a detailed map of escape routes she had planned for exactly this scenario. Hidden trails, safe houses maintained by sympathetic families, and most importantly, a railway depot in Beckley, where federal agents were known to conduct regular inspections. If Elliott could reach the depot during the morning inspection schedule, he might be able to deliver the evidence directly to federal custody before the network could intervene. The problem was that Beckley lay 40 miles away through mountains controlled by the network, and the inspection wouldn't begin until 8 a.m., less than 4 hours to cover distance that normally required 6 hours of travel on roads he couldn't use. As footsteps approached the chapel door and voices coordinated the final assault, Elliott faced the calculation that would determine whether 7 years of systematic murder would be exposed or buried forever. Risk everything on one desperate run through hostile territory, or surrender the evidence and hope that someone else would eventually uncover the truth. How many law enforcement officers throughout history have died protecting evidence that could have saved countless lives, if only they had lived long enough to deliver it? But as Elliott prepared to make his choice, he heard something that changed everything. The distant whistle of the early morning freight train running ahead of schedule and offering an opportunity that wouldn't come again for 24 hours. Sheriff Dwight Elliott shattered the chapel's rear window with his service revolver at 4:51 a.m., glass fragments, catching moonlight like scattered stars as the freight train's whistle echoed through the hollow for the second time in 30 seconds. The early morning express was running 43 minutes ahead of schedule, hauling coal from the deep mines toward Charleston, and it represented Elliott's last chance to escape Kensington County alive with evidence that could expose 7 years of systematic murder to federal authorities. Elliott's survival had become the difference between justice for 47 murdered families and the network's continued operations, expanding into neighboring states, where new hunting grounds awaited their proven methods. The train tracks ran along the base of Sunrise Ridge, approximately 800 yards downhill from the chapel, through terrain steep enough to provide cover, but treacherous enough to break a man's neck in the darkness. Elliott had hunted these slopes since childhood, but never while carrying crucial evidence and pursued by killers who knew his destination as well as he did. The locomotive's headlights swept across the mountainside as it rounded the curve below, illuminating the path Elliott needed to take, while simultaneously revealing his position to the network teams closing in on the chapel. Elliott crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at his jacket as he half ran, half fell down the steep slope. Behind him, voices coordinated the pursuit with military precision. Lowell Dalton's crews flanking left and right, while Ellen Barton's team moved directly down the ridge to cut off his approach to the tracks. They had done this before, hunting human prey through terrain that favored the pursuers over the pursued, and Elliott could hear their confidence in the casual way they called out his movements to each other. The train was slowing as it approached the water tower near Sunrise Depot, a scheduled stop that would give Elliott perhaps 90 seconds to board before it resumed full speed toward Charleston. But 90 seconds was an eternity, when measured against the closing distance of his pursuers, and Elliott realized that reaching the train alive would require more than speed. It would require the kind of desperate gamble that either saved lives or ended them. File fragment. Locomotive log. Morning Express. November 16, 1926. 4:57 a.m. Emergency stop, Sunrise Depot. Armed man boarding coal car. Request police assistance next station. Conductor J. Morrison reporting. Elliott reached the tracks just as the locomotive's brakes began screaming against steel wheels, sparks flying like fireworks in the pre-dawn darkness. The train consisted of a locomotive, tender, and 14 coal cars loaded with black diamonds from the deep mines freight that meant nothing to Elliott except as a means of escape. He sprinted alongside the slowing cars, looking for handholds on the rough wooden sides, while rifle shots began cracking from the ridge above his head. Murder rode the rails. The network had anticipated his destination, positioning sharpshooters to prevent his escape, while ground teams moved to intercept him at the depot. Elliott realized they intended to kill him during the boarding attempt, making his death appear accidental while recovering the evidence before it could reach federal authorities. But desperation bred innovation, and Elliott had one advantage his pursuers hadn't considered: intimate knowledge of the train's route and schedule, from years of coordinating law enforcement activities across county lines. Elliott grabbed the ladder on the 7th coal car as the train began accelerating again, hauling himself up onto the black mountain of coal while bullets sparked off the metal sides around him. The locomotive engineer had obviously spotted the gunfire and was increasing speed to escape what appeared to be a robbery attempt, unknowingly providing Elliott with the velocity he needed to outrun the network's ground pursuit. But Elliott's relief was short-lived. As the train rounded the next curve, he spotted vehicles racing along the parallel mountain road, Selina Vanderbilt's expensive automobile, leading a convoy that included state police cars driven by Captain Whitmore's corrupted officers. They were maintaining pace with the train, preparing to intercept it at the next depot or major crossing, where the locomotive would be forced to slow down again. The chase had become a race across 200 miles of West Virginia mountains, with Elliott's survival depending on his ability to reach Charleston before the network could coordinate a final ambush. But hidden in the coal car, clutching Dolly's evidence against his chest, Elliott began to understand something that changed his entire strategy. He didn't need to reach Charleston alive. He only needed to ensure that the evidence reached federal authorities, even if that meant making the ultimate sacrifice to guarantee its delivery. The question was no longer whether Elliott could escape the network's pursuit, but whether he could find a way to transmit the evidence before they killed him, and whether anyone would be brave enough to act on information that had already cost so many lives to obtain. How do you ensure justice when the very people sworn to protect it are the ones orchestrating the crimes? But as the train approached the industrial outskirts of Charleston, Elliott spotted something that offered hope for the first time in days. Federal agents waiting at the rail yard, apparently conducting exactly the kind of scheduled inspection that Dolly's escape plan had mentioned. If only he could signal them before the network's final assault began. Sheriff Dwight Elliott leaped from the coal car at 7:23 a.m. as the freight train shuddered to a halt in Charleston's rail yard, his boots hitting the gravel with enough force to send shockwaves through his exhausted body. The industrial air tasted of coal smoke and river mud, thick with the promise of a November rain that would wash the mountains clean of secrets. While 50 yards away, two men in federal badges examined cargo manifests with the methodical precision of agents who had been expecting exactly this kind of emergency delivery. Elliott's desperate gamble had brought him within shouting distance of salvation, but the network's final assault was already beginning as Selena Vanderbilt's convoy screeched into the rail yard with the fury of predators denied their kill. Special Agent William Crawford looked up from his clipboard as Elliott stumbled toward him, recognizing immediately that this wasn't a routine encounter, but the culmination of months of careful investigation. Crawford had been tracking the Kensington County disappearances through banking records and interstate commerce violations, building a federal case one piece at a time, but lacking the crucial inside evidence needed to justify arrests at the state level. Elliott's arrival, bloody and clutching a bundle of notebooks, represented either the breakthrough Crawford had been seeking or an elaborate trap designed to compromise his investigation. The confrontation erupted with shocking violence as State Police Captain Whitmore's corrupted officers surrounded the federal agents, badges gleaming in the morning sun while their hands rested casually on service weapons. The jurisdictional standoff that followed revealed the true scope of the network's influence, corruption that extended from local law enforcement through state government and into federal agencies that were supposed to provide oversight and justice. Elliott placed Dolly's evidence directly into Crawford's hands while explaining the network's structure, methods, and 7-year history of systematic family elimination. The notebooks contained enough documentation to justify immediate federal intervention, but only if Crawford could maintain custody of the evidence long enough to process it through channels that hadn't been compromised by network influence. File fragment. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Case file 1926-347. Evidence received from Sheriff D. Elliott confirms organized criminal enterprise. Estimated 47 families eliminated. State-level corruption confirmed. Requesting immediate arrest warrants for multiple defendants. Captain Whitmore stepped forward with the casual confidence of a man who had been orchestrating cover-ups for years, demanding that Elliott be taken into state custody on charges of interfering with a federal investigation. The accusation was crafted to create legal confusion, while allowing the network to recover the evidence and eliminate the final witness to their operations. But Crawford had been anticipating exactly this kind of interference, and his response revealed why the Bureau had assigned him to investigate the disappearances. Crawford announced that Elliott was now under federal protection as a material witness in an ongoing interstate commerce investigation, effectively removing him from state jurisdiction while simultaneously validating the evidence he had provided. The legal maneuvering that followed demonstrated both agencies' understanding that this confrontation would determine whether 7 years of systematic murder would be prosecuted or permanently buried through institutional corruption. Justice wore federal badges, but the network's influence extended deeper than anyone had realized. Judge Chauncey Langston arrived at the rail yard within minutes, carrying what appeared to be legitimate federal court orders, transferring jurisdiction back to state authorities, pending a constitutional review of Bureau investigative procedures. The documents were sophisticated forgeries, backed by legal arguments that could delay federal action for months, while the network eliminated witnesses and destroyed remaining evidence. The standoff intensified as more agents arrived from both state and federal agencies, each side claiming legitimate authority, while the evidence sat in Crawford's briefcase like a ticking bomb that could destroy careers, reputations, and lives across multiple states. Elliott realized that even reaching federal custody might not guarantee safety. The network's corruption was so extensive that they could potentially manipulate the federal system itself to achieve their goals. The breakthrough came when Crawford revealed something that changed the entire dynamic. Elliott wasn't the only sheriff who had been investigating the disappearances. Crawford had been in contact with law enforcement officers from 3 neighboring counties, all of whom had documented similar patterns of missing families and suspicious circumstances. The Kensington County network wasn't an isolated operation. It was part of a regional conspiracy that had been operating across state lines, making it definitively a federal matter regardless of local jurisdictional claims. More importantly, Crawford had been preparing for exactly this confrontation by positioning additional federal agents throughout Charleston, creating a security network that the state-level conspirators couldn't easily overcome through corruption or violence. Elliott's escape had triggered a coordinated federal response that had been months in the planning, designed to capture not just the evidence, but the entire network leadership in a single operation. But as federal agents moved to arrest Captain Whitmore and his corrupted officers, Selena Vanderbilt demonstrated why she had remained the network's leader for 7 years. She activated a contingency plan that no one had anticipated, one that threatened to destroy not just the evidence, but everyone present at the rail yard. How do you fight an enemy who would rather burn everything to the ground than face justice for decades of systematic murder? The explosion that rocked Charleston's rail yard at 8:47 a.m. would be explained in official reports as an industrial accident, but the few survivors knew they had witnessed the network's final, desperate attempt to bury their crimes in fire and smoke. Legend has it that on quiet November mornings in Charleston, you can still hear the whistle of that freight train echoing through the rail yard, carrying ghosts who refused to let their murders be forgotten. The federal courthouse in Charleston stood silent on December 15, 1926. Its limestone walls bearing witness to the largest criminal conspiracy trial in West Virginia history, while outside, snow fell like ashes from a fire that had consumed 47 families and nearly destroyed the last honest lawman in Kensington County. Inside, the surviving members of the network sat in chains, their faces masks of defiance and disbelief that their 7-year reign of systematic murder had finally been exposed to the light of federal justice. The trial that followed would reveal horrors that challenged America's understanding of how evil could flourish in isolated communities where tradition, isolation, and corruption created perfect hunting grounds for organized predators. Special Agent Crawford's investigation had ultimately recovered evidence linking the network to 83 confirmed deaths across 4 counties, making it one of the largest serial killing operations in American history. The scope went far beyond the 47 families. Documented in Dolly Ingram's notebooks, the network had been operating since 1912, perfecting their methods through more than a decade of practice before Elliott stumbled onto their activities. Financial records revealed that they had generated over $1 million through property theft, human trafficking, and what prosecutors described as commercial murder services provided to wealthy clients seeking to eliminate business rivals or inconvenient family members. Selena Vanderbilt, despite suffering severe burns in the rail yard explosion she had orchestrated, maintained her innocence throughout the trial, claiming that she was merely a successful businesswoman who had been framed by corrupt federal agents. Her testimony revealed the network's sophisticated understanding of legal procedures and jurisdictional complications. They had been operating with virtual impunity because they understood exactly how to exploit gaps in law enforcement, coordination, and federal oversight. Judge Chauncey Langston proved more cooperative, providing detailed testimony about the network's political connections in exchange for a reduced sentence. His revelations exposed corruption that reached into the governor's office, the state Supreme Court, and multiple federal agencies. The scandal ultimately triggered congressional investigations that led to reforms in interstate crime, prosecution, and federal oversight of local law enforcement. File fragment. Federal sentencing record. December 1926. Defendant Vanderbilt. Life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Defendant Langston. 25 years federal penitentiary. Total defendants sentenced 17. Estimated additional conspirators never identified, unknown. Ellen Barton's role as the network's intelligence gatherer proved most disturbing to prosecutors and public alike. Her position as schoolteacher had given her intimate access to children's lives, family structures, and community vulnerabilities, which she had systematically exploited to identify targets for elimination. During her testimony, she showed no remorse for her actions, describing the murders with the clinical detachment of a researcher discussing agricultural experiments. Child psychologists called to evaluate her impact estimated that she had directly contributed to the deaths of over 200 people, including entire families with young children who had trusted her completely. Evil taught school. But the network's most chilling legacy wasn't the murders themselves. It was the community's willingness to ignore obvious signs of systematic killing in exchange for economic benefits and social stability. The trial revealed that dozens of Kensington County residents had suspected the truth about the disappearances, but chose silence over investigation, creating a culture of complicity that enabled the network's operations for over a decade. Sheriff Dwight Elliott survived his injuries, but never returned to law enforcement, spending his remaining years as a federal witness protection coordinator, helping other whistleblowers navigate the dangerous process of exposing organized crime. His testimony during the trials provided crucial evidence about local corruption and investigative procedures, but the experience left him permanently changed. Colleagues described him as a man who had seen too much truth about human nature to ever fully trust again. The Kensington County Courthouse fire of 1947, which destroyed the remaining local records of the network's activities, was officially ruled accidental, but widely suspected to be arson committed by surviving network associates or their descendants. Many families in the region continued to harbor resentment against Elliott and the federal agents who had exposed the conspiracy, viewing them as outside agitators who had destroyed a stable, if morally compromised, social order. Federal investigations continued for decades, with new evidence periodically surfacing that suggested the network's operations had been more extensive than initially understood. Families across Appalachia reported finding hidden graves, unexplained financial transactions, and documented evidence of systematic killings that matched the network's methods. Some investigators theorized that similar operations might have existed in other isolated regions where federal oversight was limited and local corruption was endemic. The psychological impact on survivors proved lasting and complex. Children who had attended Ellen Barton's school required extensive counseling to process their experiences with a trusted authority figure who had been systematically identifying them and their families for elimination. Many developed lifelong difficulties, trusting teachers, social workers, or other community figures who claimed to have their best interests at heart. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that the network had been documenting their activities with photographic evidence, creating an archive of horror that prosecutors used during the trials, but which also suggested a level of organization and methodical planning that challenged contemporary understanding of criminal psychology. These weren't desperate individuals driven to violence by circumstance. They were calculating predators who had turned murder into a sustainable business model. The question that haunted investigators then, and continues to trouble criminologists today, wasn't how such a network could exist, but how many similar operations might be functioning in isolated communities where federal oversight remains limited and local corruption provides perfect cover for systematic evil. How many small towns across America still harbor secrets that would challenge our understanding of how organized evil can flourish when communities choose willful blindness over uncomfortable truth? We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.